as introduced, I'm Harry. My talk today is called 4.5 Methods for Theming in SCSS. A couple of quick points about this title. 4.5, basically, we're going to look at some theming and some user customization, very subtly different. We'll cover that in a little more detail in a few slides' time. We've got 4 fairly hardcore, in-depth tips or approaches for doing theming, and then like a little 5th half tip for doing user customization. The second thing with the title is the SCSS, the S is in brackets. As we'll see through a lot of the demonstrations, they don't need a preprocessor. Quick show of hands, who actually does use a preprocessor? Yeah, I assumed as much. So they don't all need a preprocessor, so some of them will be pure CSS, some of them will be Sass. Another thing as well is every talk I've ever given, except this one, is quite philosophical, quite theoretical, quite high level. This is actually the first talk I've ever given which has got super specific examples of how to do like a specific thing in Sass. So quick show of hands, who has worked recently or is currently working on a project where you require theming? Oh, brilliant. So like 20 of you will like this talk. Yeah, theming is actually surprisingly common, something I've been doing quite a lot of for the last year and a half. So I thought it might make quite an interesting departure from my normal kind of talk. Yeah, so hello, this is amazing. This is my first time in Australia. I can't believe someone flew me literally to the other side of the planet. I feel very privileged to be here. Who's from Melbourne? Melbourne's so cool. I've only been here for like 48 hours and I'm really enjoying it. So thank you very much for inviting me. Like I said, yeah, my name's Harry. I'm a consultant front-end architect. We'll come back to that in a second. I write and tweet at CSS Wizardry. Anyone who follows me on Twitter may have seen a proof of concept that I shared for this talk. I tweeted like a little Sassmeister example of some stuff. And every talk I do, I like to try and give it a hashtag. It turns out it's kind of hard to make 4.5 methods for CSS, theming in CSS into a hashtag. But for half CSS, if anyone's got any kind of disagreements, different approaches, horror stories with theming, I'd really appreciate if you could start firing tweets out. It gives us some kind of real-time feedback. It means that I can answer questions. We're not doing Q&As, so I can answer questions via Twitter. So anything at all, stick it under for half CSS. Yeah, so I am a consultant front-end architect. It's a fairly lofty job title that I invented to give to myself. But what that means is I help a lot of clients. The consultancy aspect means I sort of meet a lot of different people. I don't work for clients for 6 months at a time. I might work for them for 6 hours at a time. So I meet a lot of different clients, and they've all got very, very different problems. Kind of like being a therapist, I guess. Their problems usually revolve around some kind of scalability issue, managing CSS in large projects. Performance comes up quite a lot. But one thing that really surprised me, I mean, I worked full-time for about 7 years in kind of agency and product environments, so kind of consistent types of work. Since working for myself, I realized one surprisingly common thing, or recurring thing. Theming is really, really common. I mean, the amount of people who put their hands up just now, people tackling theming, really, really surprised me. I would guess that maybe 50–60% of my clients have needed help solving theming. Every single client I've had in 2015 has needed help with theming. So it's a lot more common than I ever realized. So that's why I kind of thought it might be nice to sort of wrap it up into a talk. The different types of clients who require theming. The reason we've got 4.5 different methods for theming is because every different type of project that requires theming has different requirements. So it's basically different types of client need different ways to theme different things. Software as a service clients. Anyone here work in a software as a service environment? Cool, a few of you. So if you've got a software as a service platform, you might want users to be able to customize that. They might need to brand it, upload their own kind of branding, use their own brand colors. That's in order to offer like a personalized but varied product range. White label clients, so anyone specifically working a white labeling product? Yeah, a few of you. So white labeling, typically you'll find that the client wants a completely bespoke theme. Like they'll give you their brand guidelines, and they'll want you to have like, you'll have a one-to-one relationship with that client, and you'll build a completely bespoke theme for them. Hub clients, now this is terrible, the phrase hub client is really bad, but I couldn't think of anything better. What I mean by this is, imagine a fairly large product. The BBC is probably the best example I can think of. The BBC site has loads of sub-sites within it, so BBC Sport is like quite a bright yellow. BBC News is a really rich crimson red. So you might have one large product where subsections of that product need to have different sub-themes, so that's a different type of theming we might need. I've also recently worked with a number of social networks who want to offer customization, right? So not theming, but customization. I imagine nearly everyone here will have a Twitter profile. You can customize your Twitter profile to be your own colors, right? So that's customization. So I've helped people solve that kind of thing. This talk should hopefully wrap up at least one of each of these different requirements and offer some kind of solution. So that kind of brings me nicely on to the difference between theming and customization. The way I see it, UI design has three distinct layers. There's the design, that's what we do, that's like the vanilla, this is the baseline, this is what it looks like. On top of the design, we could sit a theme, and on top of the theme, we could optionally sit customization. So there's a subtle but significant difference. Theming is by and large defined by developers. It's defined by us. We do the theming. We'll have designers who create 5 different versions of a UI. We'll have developers who build those 5 different versions. So theming is done by us. It requires developer input. There are usually a finite amount of variants. Your designers might create 5 different skins for the same UI. 5, it's a finite amount, so it means that we've got an understood and a known quantity of rules and constraints. We understand fully what we can and can't theme. A really good example of this would be Jeremy Keith's website. Hopefully you're all familiar with Jeremy Keith. You hit his website, on the right-hand side you will see this drop-down where Jeremy has built a number of different themes that you can view his site in. Jeremy designed these themes, he built them, he was in complete control of it, and we as users can invoke them. So theming is done entirely by the dev team, or the design and dev team. Customization, on the flip side, is defined entirely by users, right? So the users can decide what their UI looks like. MySpace.com is probably one of the sort of biggest and oldest examples, right? You could completely customize how your MySpace profile looked. Doesn't require any developer input, well, except for like the initial mechanism to take the input from the user, but all the design is done by the user, which gives you infinite possibilities. Think back to the MySpace example. So whatever the user says goes, and this is customization. A really good example of customization would be Twitter.com. At the lower half of this screenshot, we can decide our own colors, our own color scheme. This screenshot's particularly useful because the top half is theming, right? So Twitter designers have made 19 different themes. And then we can lay some customization on top of that. So hopefully that's kind of outlined the differences between theming and customization. So we've got 4 fairly beefy tips for theming UIs and then a bonus tip for customizing them. One thing I thought might be quite interesting to include in this talk is the advice I would give a client when they come to me asking for theming. If a client comes to me and says, oh, we need this, 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 and this, and we need it themable, I very rarely just say, yeah, we'll do that. The first thing I'll try and do is talk the client out of it. Unless theming actually gives some real business value, don't bother. Jeremy Keith's website, for example, his style switcher, I very much doubt that actually leads to more inquiries, more conversions. If there isn't a business case for theming, just don't bother. It doesn't really solve any problem, and it's actually a lot of maintenance overhead. You've got to design 5 versions of the same theme. It means you've got to build and maintain and sort of constantly bug check and test 5 versions of the same theme. So just avoid it if you can. If there is a business case, if you can't avoid it, keep it as simple as possible. Try and lessen the workload of doing any theming. A good way to do this would be only to theme completely cosmetic parts of a UI. Basically, don't make box model properties part of your theming ability. The background color of a button won't break a page's layout, but the padding of a button might do. So when you're doing theming, try and limit it to purely cosmetic aspects. The next thing after that is enforce rules. This is particularly important if you are a white-labeled service. When the client asks you for very bizarre requests around theming, it's really important to have a set of rules in place. Like tell them that, look, seriously, you can't have a completely bespoke homepage layout because deviation is really expensive. As soon as you create a fully bespoke solution for someone, that's like a separate version of the code base. It's another thing you have to change. I worked with a client last year who they had a white-labeled solution with 200 clients, and every one of the 200 clients had the ability to have a completely custom homepage. That meant that any change to the core service had to be replicated 200 times, any UI change. Way too expensive, way too expensive. So that means you can use it as an upsell, right? So if I work with a software as a service client, I tell them that, yeah, if your client asks for a bespoke homepage, tell them it's going to cost like $10,000, $15,000. Pick a number that's big enough that will make them say no. But importantly, right, a number that's big enough that if they say yes, well, you've made a bit of money. So yeah, try and put them off, but make it worth your while. If they're really adamant, make it worth your while. Yeah, quick note on preprocessors then. I hinted at this at the beginning. We'll find that some of the examples don't need a preprocessor at all. Some of them you couldn't use a preprocessor. Some of them don't need a preprocessor, but for convenience and for sort of terseness, we're going to use one. And some of them, you definitely need a preprocessor. My advice, though, would be if you're going to do any kind of theming, just use one. It's going to make it tons simpler. The preprocessor we're going to look at in this talk is Sass, but anyone who uses less or anything, stylus, I'm pretty sure the principles are transferable. Okay, right. Yeah, finally, to get onto the 4.5 tips. The first one is what I call the theme layer. Now, all of the names for these different methods are names I've invented. So if you think of a better one, again, just fire it out as a tweet because I'm not claiming these are the best terms. Okay, so the theme layer is probably something we're all very used to. If we've worked on a theming project from sort of 5 years ago to now, we're probably used to this. It's basically just writing new CSS, additional CSS, to override the default look and feel of a UI. Like I said, it's probably the most common approach that we'll probably find currently, because it's just really simple. We write new CSS, we write subsequent CSS to override the vanilla theme. So we'll have the design baseline, and we'll just write some more CSS to override that and just create a completely custom UI. Which means that it's very well suited to completely custom things. If you need to do bespoke theming for a client, if you need to add on their specific brand, you might do this. Just write some more CSS to extend and override the default theme. Very, very rudimentary, very simple, very crude. How it might look on the file system is, this is using Sass, doesn't need to. The naming convention I'm using here is from an architecture that I'm currently in the sort of middle of writing up. ITCSS, inverted triangle CSS. Each file gets a namespace, so we've got a components file, which is specifically a tabs component. And then any number of lines of Sass later, we import a theme file, a corresponding theme file for the tabs. We can take this as far as we want. We could have component tabs, components.buttons, and then a corresponding theme file for each. The ellipsis just means an arbitrary amount of Sass later. This could be 10 imports later, it could be 110. And yeah, dead simple, right? Can you see, the screen's a little washed out. Can you read the comments in this? Cool. So yeah, the components file, dead simple. We just have the default, kind of the tabs are gray, and we import the theme file a little later on. We know what's going to happen here. This is not going to get rendered by the browser. It's just going to kind of go to waste. All we're doing here is writing new CSS to override the default look and feel. The good is that we can swap layers out. Because we've got theme.tabs, theme.buttons, we can get rid of theming really easily. If we need a number of themes, we can have theme.red.tabs, theme.blue.tabs. We can swap these around so we can take themes in and out. It means that if the requirement for theming ever disappears, it's as simple as deleting every theme.file in your codebase. It kind of isolates all the themes, keeps it separate to the default UI. And you can theme anything, right? Because we're writing new CSS, we're not limited to just changing colors. We could change font families, we could change all the links to be underlined or not underlined, so we can do a lot of custom stuff here. The bad, lots of redundancy. Anything that's themed 50% of the declarations will go to waste. Half of the CSS for theming just won't get used. Wasted CSS over the wire. We could use some tooling to get rid of the redundancy, but for the sake of this proof of concept I've shown you, redundancy is a problem. And a problem is potentially the fact that this styling is now split over multiple files. That's a good thing in terms of encapsulation, but it means that anybody new to the project has to be aware of the fact that, okay, if I need to change the color of the tabs, I might have to look in 2 files for that. So that's a potential downside. Like I say, that's probably the most common variant of theming we're probably used to. The second method I've got to share with you is what I call stateful theming. I really, really like stateful theming. It's dead simple, but you can do some pretty cool stuff with it. Stateful theming is basically styling a UI based on a condition or a state. We can invoke a condition and tell the UI to behave accordingly. We can have different skins based on these conditions, and it allows themes to be switched on the client. So the important thing here is that the user sees the theme changing. So Jeremy Keith's style switcher, that theme gets changed on the client. The user is aware that the theme has changed. The condition has changed, therefore the theme reacts. It's really well suited to style switchers, like I said, Jeremy Keith's website. And it's really good to individually styled sections of a site. So the BBC example, if you go from BBC News to BBC Sport, you will see things change from red to yellow. The user sees that change. That's the key with this kind of method. Anybody who uses Trello will probably, or hopefully be used to the fact that, or aware of the fact you can change Trello's theming. So it's blue by default, you can change it to orange or red or whatever. This is stateful theming. The user is invoking a state, telling the UI to change, and it reacts accordingly. That's a style switcher. The BBC website, hopefully you can see the nav at the top there has got like a different color associated with it. You probably can't see that, so the next example is probably a little better. If you're familiar with Paul Lewis, Aero Twist, his blog, every section of his site has a different color. So if you're in the blog section, it's different color to the lab section. This is stateful theming. The condition here is if the user is viewing the blog, be this color, otherwise be this color if they're in the lab, etc. Way of tackling this is simply using sort of nesting, or SAS's parents like to have kind of reverse nesting. So the tabs are gray, but when it's inside a t-red context, just be red. The t-hyphen's another naming convention from the inverted triangle CSS architecture. If I see a t-hyphen class in some markup, that tells me that, okay, this is responsible for theming. Using SAS's parent selector, which just means the tabs went in this context, the tabs went inside this parent, basically compiles out to this. So presumably we're all familiar with that. It's really straightforward stuff. Now all we need to do is we've compiled all these conditions. The way I describe it is, I don't know if you can see the red, but tabs is the subject, the key selector is the subject of a selector. Everything before that is the condition, the conditions. So we just need to turn these switches on. The most traditional, most common way of doing this is t-red on the body element. The UI reacts accordingly. So if that's a style switcher, that might be putting a class on the body with JavaScript. If it's a section of a site, like the BBC website or Paul Lewis's website, we would programmatically add that class to the body element. So t-red is the switch. Change that to t-blue, and we know that the UI will react accordingly. Again, this should hopefully be really simple stuff. I don't think there's anything profound here. Where it does get kind of cool is when we start to use stateful utility classes. They act a bit like decorators. So if you've got this kind of this stateful UI, this UI that can have a different theme depending on the condition, you might want to make sure that every single heading always renders in the color of that current theme. You might want to make sure that if the theme's red, all the headings should be red. If the theme's blue, the headings should all be blue. So a way of doing this is you can have these stateful utility classes that act almost like variables, like semi-intelligent CSS classes. So there's the utility u-color current, and that will have different conditions based on the current theme, right? So using the parent selector again, we would compile this out to this. And the color current class always points at whatever the currently invoked theme is. So now we can use that to decorate the UI. We can decorate the DOM with this utility class, and we can basically make bits of the DOM track the current theme. So we might have a page title component that always has to render in whatever color the current state of the UI is. Here are the conditions, and we can just put this kind of steel thread right through the UI and make it kind of track things. The good is we can bundle a number of themes into one code base. So if we've got a style switcher, or we move from different parts of the site from one to the other, it's already on the user's machine. It's already on the user's device, so it's fairly quick to take place. It's really great for style switchers and areas of a website. So the Trello style switcher, Jeremy Keith's style switcher, Paul Lewis's different colored sections for his blog. And you can theme anything. Once again, we're writing CSS. We've got access to write new CSS. We can theme anything. The bad is that we bundle a number of themes into one code base. That's quite a big hit. If nobody uses the style switcher, if nobody goes from one section of the site to the other, we've sent CSS over the wire that hasn't been used. Again, we could potentially use tooling to get rid of this, but for this proof of concept, there is a potential for redundancy. The third method, config theming. Config theming definitely requires a preprocessor. Config theming is basically invoking a theme based on a setting. We have access to a setting that when we change it, the theme reacts accordingly. So it's good for switching between themes dev side. So the previous example, the user saw that theme changing. This is good if you, as developers, want to spit out 5 different versions of the same UI. So we can compile the same CSS project a number of times, just with a different setting. This would be useful for if you had, for example, you do a white labeled product, but you don't offer completely bespoke theming. So a client might say, yeah, I would like a license of your white labeled product, and I'd like it to be on the dark theme. So that theme doesn't change on the client. The user doesn't see that theme changing. It gets chosen once and just gets used forever. So here what you do is you'd compile out a red version, a blue version, a light version, a dark version. The way we do this on the file system, settings.config. So this is a settings file, specifically the site's config, and we've got the component.tabs again. The simplest, most pragmatic, cheapest, dirtiest, quickest way to get this off the ground is just have a theme variable, a global variable telling you that the theme is red. Then inside the partial for the tabs, we just have a little bit of logic. If the theme's red, do this, otherwise fall back to gray. It means if we change the theme to blue, if we had more if statements, if I had bigger slides, we could have a series of conditions in there to just spit out the same UI with a different skin. Not really necessary for this talk, but I thought I'd stick it in there anyway. Having a nice config map is really useful. You can have environment kind of information, theme information, debug, true or false. Hoik that back out of the map using this bit of this function here, and it's just slightly nicer syntax. If the config theme is red, do this. The good is that we only send as little CSS over the wire as is needed. We don't send any redundant CSS over the wire because we compile things ourselves. The CSS file is exactly as big as it needs to be. We can alter the entire theme from one location. We just change one setting, we change one variable, the entire project reacts accordingly, recompiles. And again, we can theme anything. We're not limited to just colors here. We could change font sizes, font families, font weights, etc. The bad, lots of logic in your Sass, right? It's ugly as hell. There's stuff littered everywhere. It's going to be quite cumbersome to work with. We just looked at one tabs example, but when you've got every component themable, you might have 5 if-else blocks inside each partial. It only supports a finite number of themes, so because we have to do them up front, we have to write 5 if-else blocks. And adding new themes could be quite tedious. If you add a 6th theme, that means opening every partial, adding a new else, and then doing, it can get really messy. So, I mean, it's good if you don't need to change your themes very often, but because the logic is littered throughout your entire project, it can be really tedious and cumbersome to work with. The next method, theme palettes. Theme palettes are not an entirely new concept. You'll have seen something like them before, I imagine. Theme palettes is basically front-loading the entire theme information, the entire sort of color palette, front-loading all of that into one settings file, and then just using that information later on in the project. So yeah, you would get into, this is perfect if you do completely bespoke kind of stuff for clients. They would send their brand guidelines or you would chat with their designers. You've got complete access to their branding information. You can front load all of this data, all this information into a settings file and just inject that later on. You can recycle all this stuff. Really good for fully bespoke theming. So like I say, if you've got a client who has to have a UI that looks exactly like they designed it, this is the kind of thing you'd need to use. Yeah, it's good for specific branding. So I did a project for the NHS, England's health service. It was an e-learning platform. So we basically built them a big kind of treehouse, but private to the NHS, where doctors and nurses and surgeons and all these kind of people could go and learn about how to do their job better. There's a new government initiative in England where, I don't know if it's actually legislation, I don't know if it's law yet, but one of the requirements for this project was it had to be themable, because this legislation that's either in place or coming into place is that any government project, IT project that's paid for by the taxpayer should be open sourced, which I think is a really admirable thing. I think that's really nice. So I was told that, yeah, when you build the UI for this e-learning platform, it needs to be themable, because if we open source it, we need to make sure that whoever implements it can add their own branding, so it doesn't look like an NHS project. So it was for this project that I used a theme palette. And theme palettes look a bit like this. So we've got a settings file again, settings.palette, and then a number of lines of Sass later, we import the components.tabs again. Now, settings.palette.scss just contains a big raft of variables, tons of variables. This file would not produce any CSS. Now, what we do here is we have a series of what I call literal variables. So color red mapped straight onto the keyword red. It could be hash F00, it could be crimson, it could be anything. But in this project, the shade of red is the color keyword red. Then what we do inside the same file, we reassign that literal variable onto a semantic variable. So we kind of daisy chain the variable so that the background of the tabs is the same as whatever color red is, and in turn, color red is the keyword red. Now, the benefit of doing this is that when we call color tabs background later on in the project, it's a semantic variable. It means that we don't actually put the red information anywhere inside that partial. This is the same reason we're told not to use classes like class equals red. Because if red ever becomes blue, then the DOM gets confusing. It's the same principle. What this means is any changes we make to the theme can be made in one place, and they will propagate through the project whilst everything still makes complete sense. This daisy chaining allows us to keep things super clean, really nice and tidy. To expand on that a little bit then, we could front load all of the information from our client. So we could go to the client and get all of their branding information, front load it all into this file. So yeah, the brand color, the highlight, the red, green, and blue variables map straight onto the keywords, red, green, and blue. And yeah, we just daisy chain them, we reassign them onto these semantic variables, these meaningful variables that we can just kind of pepper throughout the project, and everything stays sane, it stays sensible. The good, zero redundancy. Because we're actually editing Sass here, we compile out exactly as much CSS as we need, nothing more. Completely perfect for bespoke theming. Anything that needs to be open sourced or completely white labeled, completely bespoke, you would use a theme palette. You can add as much bespoke stuff as you like. And you can completely restyle the entire project from one file. So the previous example, we could change the theme from one file, but we still had all that logic in all of our Sass. With this method, we can actually completely alter what that theme is. So we don't just turn the theme on and off from one file, we actually define it in one place and one place only. The bad is that we are limited mainly just to theming colors. Now, if we go back to what I said right at the beginning, this is actually a good thing, right? We shouldn't allow clients to change the padding on their buttons and the font sizes of things, because that just adds complexity. If you need to do that kind of stuff, this method kind of limits you to just doing cosmetic things. You could write some slightly more clever Sass. So instead of just having colors in the palette file, you could have $links underline true or false, and then write a bit of logic in your links partial. But yeah, for this proof of concept, you're limited by the fact that it's mainly just cosmetic. I keep mentioning these proof of concepts. At the end, the last slide, there'll be a link to download an example of each one of these, so you can have a little tinker, a little hack with them. So each proof of concept is limited by the downsides I've outlined. You could expand them, you could do some cleverer stuff. But yeah, for the sake of this talk, these are all problems or potential problems with these methods. Okay, so the bonus, fifth, 4.5 tip is about user customization. So theming, everything in the last 4 examples was our responsibility. We decided that, we defined that. Customization, it's now the user's turn to do things. So we let users style their own UI, or we get to let them decide certain bits of the UI. Now, because the user's doing it, we wouldn't actually expose any CSS to them. They wouldn't actually edit any style information directly. What they'd probably do is have a little admin panel or a little place in their admin part of the CMS where they just get a little color picker and they could pick their brand color. It's usually as simple as that. It's really well suited to social networks. So like Twitter.com, perfect example. There is business value in this, if you want to really stretch the definition of business value. Brands use Twitter because they can have their branding, their brand color. Being able to have your slice of a social network or a platform, you own that part of the social network. It probably increases engagement. So user customization can be quite a nice thing. Software as a service platforms. So the method I'm about to show you, I actually implemented for a client recently. They had a huge software product. They had 10,000, I say huge, for the size of the company they were, it was pretty huge. They had 10,000 customers using this off-the-shelf software as a service platform. Now, obviously, it's completely impractical to do a bespoke theme for 10,000 customers. It just couldn't happen. But it had to be brandable. It was a sports platform where each site, each instance of this product needed to be in the club's colors, right? Their football strip colors. So they needed user customization. They couldn't pick up the phone to 10,000 customers and put that in manually. They needed to allow the user to do this themselves. Now, I really, really like the method I'm about to show you because it's really ugly. It's really unconventional. It's kind of a bit hipstery. I really like it, and we'll see what you think. Remember a few methods ago I told you about the decorator classes, the utility, stateful utilities? We're going to use these decorators again. So what we do is we just do something like this. We take the input from that CMS. It's the word red here, but it would more likely be a hex value if it's from a color picker. What we do is we take that from the CMS, put it into the database, then pull it back out of the database and just stick it in the view. We just build a style block, put it all in the view, bind onto these decorators, these helper classes, then we just go and decorate, we color in the UI. If we want the user to be able to color in their tabs, we just put the class on the tab. So it means every bit of theming is completely opt-in. It's really unconventional, really ugly, but it's a nice way to safeguard things and it's very pragmatic. So yeah, just dump it all in the view. Get the hex values from the CMS into the database, pull it back out, drop it into the HTML. And the important thing to note here is that we are binding onto utility classes. We're not creating a list of selectors like .tabs, .button, .dropdown, background color red, because that would make a huge style block. What we do is we bind onto utility classes and then use those classes to decorate the UI, just like this. Now, this is the same method that Twitter use. Twitter actually use this. If you go and do a view source of your own Twitter profile, you will find this method. It's what they used to do user customization. When I did a view source and I looked at it, I was like, geez, that's frightful. My first thought was, that was probably Nicholas Gallagher. And it was. I sent him a DM. I was like, dude, was this you? And it turns out, yeah, it was Nicholas Gallagher. It's got all the hallmarks of Nicholas Gallagher. He's a genius. I absolutely loved that. I love that I knew this was him. I'll just zoom in on that. So if you go to your Twitter profile view source, you've got this kind of stuff. Binding onto these decorator classes, using them throughout the DOM to color things in. It's fantastic. It's so pragmatic. It's effective. It just works. So the good is that it requires zero developer input. You can allow the user to color in their own UI without you having to lift a finger, except for the initial mechanism of taking that data into the database and sticking it back out into the DOM. It lets the user do all the theming. Like I said, it lets them have their slice of the platform. It lets them have their own bit of that product, and that could increase engagement. It's just like a nice-to-have thing. And it's incredibly pragmatic. Just a show of hands again, who works in-house or on a product? You guys, probably more than others, might understand the importance of pragmatism, right? We just need to get it done. It needs to be quick, effective. We need to get this done. This is that to a T, and that's why I really like it. The bad is that it requires zero developer input, right? You could end up with the next MySpace. There's nothing stopping a user putting red text on a green background. There's nothing stopping a user putting white text on a white background. So, I mean, we actually have to let go of a lot of the decisions. Thinking back to the previous talk about accessibility with color, we're letting go of the ability to define that. So we could lose a lot of, or we could end up with a lot of mistakes because of just per user decisions. Or we could end up with MySpace and they all just look disgusting. Lots of redundancy again. A lot of the CSS that gets written, even just into the view, isn't actually going to get used. So 50% of the theming or the customization declarations will just have strike-throughs in Inspector, which means, yeah, wasted CSS over the wire. Another problem is we lose the ability to cache these styles. Obviously, the expense, the cost of taking that information from the CMS, putting it in the taking it from the CMS, writing it to a CSS file, writing that to disk, linking that up in the head of the document, hashing it and cache busting it each time the user changes their mind. That's quite a lot of overhead. So the most pragmatic solution is to just stick it in the view, but that does mean we lose the ability to cache these styles. I haven't changed my Twitter profile in the last 6 years. So for 6 years, that information's kind of gone to waste. It hasn't been cached. Okay, so to kind of start wrapping up, we've just blitzed through 5 different ways of theming UIs. When do we use which one? Really handy checklist to work this out, really handy. First question you should ask yourself, who's actually doing the styling? Who's defining the look and feel? If it's the user who gets to decide things, then straight away the answer is user customization. If the user gets to decide the exact look and feel or the colors used, you have to use user customization, no other option. The second question, do the themes need to change once they're on the client? Does the user need to see these changes to the UI? If you need the user to see the UI changing, you either need stateful theming, style switches or going from different sections of a site to another, or you need user customization again. Do you have themes that you want to be able to toggle, or you want users to toggle? So this is specifically a style switcher. You need stateful theming. You need to put a class on the body element and set up an entire context for that theme. Do you have sections of the site, so like Paul Lewis's site or the BBC website, that need to look different as you enter or leave them? Again, stateful theming. Do you have a list of themes that a client could potentially choose from? They could choose the light theme or the dark theme, the red or the black theme. You need config theming. Spit out the same UI, spit out the same CSS file in X amount of different themes. Do that dev side, right? Do that with a bit of SASConfig. And finally, do you need to offer completely bespoke theming? Do you have white-labeled clients who need their UI to look exactly like their brand? If that's the case, you need either the first method, the theme layer, the old school kind of writing new CSS to override things, or if it's a greenfield project, you might want to use a slightly more elegant theme palette. Front-load all of the theme information and just use that throughout the project. So that's wrapping up now. I just want to say thank you all for listening. The slides are already online, so you can go and get those. The examples, or an example of each of these, can be found at that URL. I'll try and leave this up as long as possible. Those are the URLs. So thank you very much.